After years and years of various gaming communities' efforts to break down and understand the games they love, many terms and abbreviations have been created. Examples are OOB, which stands for going out of bounds, the infamous bunny hopping technique to increase movement speed, or duping, which usually implies the duplication of items. Out of all of them, the one that I've had to explain the most in the 8+ years that I've spent speedrunning is difficulty adjustment, which we simply call DA. The series mostly known for implementing DA in many titles is Resident Evil. In this video, I'm going to explain what DA is, give examples as to how developers of the Resident Evil series have implemented it into the games, and how it can positively or negatively affect the experience. Let's get started with a simple explanation of how difficulty adjustment may function. When someone boots up a game for the first time, it usually starts with set values for things like damage dealt by enemies, damage dealt by the player, item drop chance, puzzle solutions, enemy aggression, and many other things. If the game has DA, these values may change based on the player's performance. This is what gives the player's experience a sense of flow. The game flow is going up and down in an attempt to make the game not too easy, but not too hard. It is a balancing act based on the ability of the player. Let's say someone is playing a game that has difficulty selection and they choose normal instead of easy or hard. The game may start at rank 5 based on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being the lowest and 10 being the highest. At 5 DA, the player will take 25 damage from a normal attack out of the 100 health points they have. At rank 7, they'll start to take 35 damage. The way this value changes is usually based on how well the player is performing. Let's say they get through a few areas without taking damage and killing every enemy along the way. The value might raise from level 5 to level 7 based on their performance in just those few areas. It realizes that the player can take a bit of a challenge and will adjust accordingly. It's a bit difficult to tell if it's an effect when small changes occur, but sometimes DA is quite obvious. God Hand comes to mind because in that game, it isn't hidden at all. In fact, it's on the screen. When playing on normal difficulty, skulls are displayed in the HUD to represent the level you're on. Level 1 is green, level 2 is blue, and level 3 is red. Oh yeah, and then there's also a level 4, which is Die, Death Metal Skull with a Crown. Yeah, Shinji Mikami's just cool like that. To give a few more examples of games that have a variant of DA, there's Crash Bandicoot, Ratchet & Clank 2, Silent Hill 4, Max Payne, Devil May Cry 3, and even Left 4 Dead. All of these games have variants of difficulty adjustment or dynamic difficulty, and sometimes they work completely different from one another. As simple as some systems might be, it can take a lot of research to understand exactly how they work. Kind of like YouTube's DA system. I don't know what my rank is here, but it feels like a 9 sometimes. I'll say that much. Please, subscribe and like the video if you want to help me lower it. Thank you in advance. Seeing as DA can be well hidden, third-party tools may be needed to fully understand it. Many of the modern Resident Evil games have tools named SRTs, or speedrun tools, to track the hidden DA levels. Without tools like these, it's hard to determine the DA rankings, what they change, and how it will affect challenge runs or speedruns. A ton of testing needs to be done to understand how each game treats its ranking and numbers. And now that you know the basics of DA, I'm happy to say that it's time to finally dive into Resident Evil and the real reason behind this video. Let's begin. In 2005, Resident Evil 4 released with the first iteration of DA that truly shook things up. In the case of RE4, the explanation I gave earlier for you is the 1 to 10 scale determining game flow. That is the system that this game uses, and it changes damage dealt, damage taken, enemy aggression, item drops, and even enemy spawns. It's a great balancing act, and probably one of the smartest examples of implementing DA without it being flat out mentioned or advertised to the player during their initial experience. On Professional, the DA level is capped at the highest, so let's focus on Normal. Leon taking damage, Ashley taking damage, either of them dying, and being very inaccurate with your weapons will all lead to lowering the DA rank. Hurting or killing enemies and going long amounts of time with no damage taken will raise it. This can completely change how someone experiences Resident Evil 4 for the first time, as it's very easy to switch from mowing down enemies with no problem in one chapter to getting swarmed by highly aggressive enemies that do enough damage to 3-shot you in the next chapter. Fortunately, every loading screen door in this game is a checkpoint, so this game not only does a great job at balancing the numbers on various mechanics, but it also gives the player the chance to lose minor progress and get right back into the action. A lot of interesting choices with enemy and item spawns occurs with this as well. For enemies, we'll start with the water hall, as it's an infamous room in the game. If the player does well until this room, 9 enemies will spawn at the beginning, as well as a squad of scythmen after lowering the stairs. If the player isn't doing so well and falls below a certain ranking, the 2 crossbow enemies will be despawned entirely, and the scythe squad that appears after lowering the stairs won't appear either. The difference between these 2 scenarios is staggering, and some people probably played the game without a clue that there were crossbow dudes in that room, or the scythe squad. Similarly to enemy variants, there's also item variants. Depending on your DA and your inventory, the game will drop certain items more often because it tracks what you already have. If you're on low health with no healing items, the game will drop herbs from the enemies or the boxes that don't have set items in them. The lower the DA ranking, the higher chance you'll get a first aid spray. This is the game helping you out for getting damaged so much. If you have no healing items but your DA is kind of high, the game might continue to drop ammo instead, knowing you can take the challenge. One last significant thing to mention about RE4's implementation is that damage values are going up and down with the DA rankings. This is very important because if you feel like you don't have enough ammo or healing items to beat a boss, dying will lower your DA to ensure that you can achieve that victory. For most, this is just trial and error, but for some it does prevent soft locking, which is a big complaint about certain other games in this series. In general, Resident Evil 4, while it may not have an amazing DA system, it did set a nice standard, and the teams behind future Resident Evil titles would continue to use it in main titles and spin-offs. Although, not every team understood how to balance it correctly. In Resident Evil 5 and 6, DA works similarly to RE4, and it generally doesn't cause issues or greatly impact casual playthroughs as much as RE4 does. The system would improve over time, until Capcom's newest titles in their Reach the Moon engine, aka RE Engine. Starting with 2017's release of Resident Evil 7, the DA is fairly well done in the way that it doesn't really change much unless you are really struggling. And I mean really struggling. Taking an absolute ton of damage and dying a bunch is the only way that you're going to see this game throw you a bone.
Family, son.
Dealing damage yourself doesn't really raise it much either, so it's fairly simple to play through the game without changing ranks. If I had to guess, only about 0.01% of players have actually ever experienced what it's like to have their DA rank change enough to make a difference in RE7, many of them probably being speedrunners or challenge runners who know about it. This is because the game is so well balanced already that it doesn't even need a DA system to help out. They could have removed it entirely here if they wanted. Even Madhouse difficulty is well balanced for a second playthrough, a lot more so than some of the other harder difficulties in the next 3 RE Engine games. Speaking of, Resident Evil 2 Remake. Most people would agree that this is an amazing addition to the series, but its DA system is horrendous. So let's dive into that as the first example of how a DA system can cause a negative effect. RE2 Remake is generally a well-balanced experience, especially for players who decide to play on Assisted or Hardcore, as the game is quite generous on Assisted and Hardcore DA doesn't vary enough to be a big issue. Considering how many people were introduced to the series through this title and RE7, most people pick Normal or Standard for their first-time playthroughs, which could have been the case for all 4 scenarios here before trying Hardcore out at all. I'm sure a lot of you watching fall into this category of player, and I have a question for you. Did you ever find yourself shooting a zombie in the head 20 times before it finally died? Yep, that's difficulty adjustment, and I'm about to explain why that even happens. A huge part of the Resident Evil experience is the focus on survival in the horror genre. Successfully disposing of dangerous creatures while taking little to no damage is encouraged in these games. So let's take this step by step. There's a room of 4 zombies, and you decide to take care of all of them to make the area easier and less dangerous to navigate and backtrack through. As you're shooting one zombie to death, your DA raises shot by shot. Upon the zombie finally being dead, you work on the next zombie, and killing that one raises your overall ranking. Now the next 2 zombies are going to take more ammo to kill, but let's say you've run low and you can't quite get the job done. You go pick up more ammo, right? Well, that's when this step-by-step process gets a little weird. Picking up ammos and sub-weapons raises your DA.
What the fuck?
Yeah, that's right. You go pick up ammo to raise your DA, just to go back to those other zombies to spend more ammo killing them and raise your DA again, to then have to pick up more ammo to go kill the other room of zombies, which raises your DA again, and suddenly, you're actually on hardcore difficulty ranking.
What the fuck?
This general cycle of playing the game as intended ends up being way more in favor of the game in a lot of situations. To the point where doing this cycle over and over again can deplete ammo and healing items pretty quickly, which then leads to the next issue, checkpoints. On standard difficulty, various checkpoints are spread throughout the scenarios, giving the player a chance to avoid losing a lot of progress if they hadn't saved in a while. The problem with that is that a lot of new players, and even old players, don't bother to make hard saves through their playthroughs when checkpoints exist. So after going through the cycle of depleting ammo and healing items because you decide to kill enemies and pick stuff up, these checkpoints may lead to you not being able to do things differently without loading a save that might be very far back. I would assume that most players think, it's just standard, I got this. When, really, the game has been on hardcore ranks here and there. This results in some zombie bites and liquor swipes bringing you from full health straight to caution, or from caution straight to danger, which then leads to the next subject, which is deaths.
Wow, this has just been such a pleasure. I'm such a lucky boy. I can't wait to go home.
If you go through this vicious cycle of higher difficulty, thinking you're doing a great job, and then enter a boss fight, chances are you have minimal resources, and your rank is high, and it's going to be hell. You're probably gonna die. And much like the other games, dying lowers your DA. But there's an issue with this. Players don't know that. Dying over and over again leads to the amount of resources you have on hand possibly becoming inviable to kill the boss because the DA rank lowers. The game made it easier for you. Now you're probably thinking, Maxi, isn't that what difficulty adjustment is for? You said that as if it was a good thing in OGRE4 earlier. Well, yes, but not after it completely ruins the resource management of your entire playthrough up until that exact moment you died 4 times. Resident Evil 4, 5, and 6 are all games where resources are plentiful, going as far as to just throw ammo and heals at you constantly, with enemy drops and lots of boxes because of their action-packed gameplay formulas. You won't recover inventory like that in RE2 Remake's more survival horror-based style. If this game didn't try to punish you for collecting items, it would be far more balanced. Unfortunately, that's just not the case with this game, and while it's still an amazing Resident Evil experience, that is one of its biggest flaws. Now you're probably wondering, well dang, is it this bad in Resident Evil 3 Remake? I have 3 words for you. It is worse. Resident Evil 3 Remake brings back the dodge mechanic from the original, and as awesome as it is, the game raises your DA by a large amount every time you perform a successful dodge. Playing well by killing enemies and not taking damage is how the difficulty should adjust, but an intended mechanic like dodging shouldn't be raising it as much as it does, or at all if you ask me. If you don't know about DA, you're simply performing a cool mechanic that is encouraged by the game, and unknowingly making the game harder the more you do it. On the other hand, if you do know, then it just enforces the idea that you shouldn't be using that dodge mechanic because it'll just help you conserve more resources in the long run. The only reason why this game doesn't have such an immediately noticeable difference like RE2 Remake's standard difficulty is because this game's just a lot easier in general. You have more tools, you have more mechanics, it's just way easier, and you're pretty overpowered on standard, and even hardcore. It isn't until you start trying out Nightmare and Inferno difficulties, especially without New Game Plus weapons, that things get tricky. At that point, Nightmare is actually very fair, while still being quite a challenge, because the difficulty adjustment caps appropriately at 9,999, giving the player a mostly consistent experience. Inferno, on the other hand, is an embarrassingly bad example of a harder difficulty. Inferno is just Nightmare, but its DA ranking goes all the way to 18,000.
Well, these are pretty cool bananas.
This is an unnecessarily high range compared to the other games, and picking this difficulty no longer has much meaning or feeling of accomplishment apart from beating Final Nemesis. Almost everyone who has played Inferno without New Game Plus weapons has probably died a ton, including myself. This means that we all just played a weirdly varied version of Nightmare with no differences other than certain HP and damage values dictated by a hidden number that has such a wide range that there is no consistency whatsoever. It's honestly a bit lazy, and it's also kind of contradictory to picking the hardest difficulty in the game. In almost all of the previous RE games, harder difficulties tended to mean exactly that. It may have been artificial difficulties based on health and damage values, but at least those values were consistent throughout the games. The difficulty you picked is the difficulty you got. You're making the choice to play it on the hardest difficulty, and that is why the victory is so sweet. Whether it's RE4, 5, or Revelations, they all consistently provided that challenge that you decided to take on. With Resident Evil 3 Remake, you have two difficulties that are seemingly almost the same, but one of them just has a stupidly wide range of what the artificial numbers are, instead of having some type of set differences between the two. If what I have explained so far isn't enough for people to think that difficulty adjustment should just probably be thrown in the bin at this rate, let's keep moving forward to Resident Evil Village. Village... well, actually, it's fine. It's quite literally completely fine. It's back to being a decent system. Almost like a hybrid between how Resident Evil 7 only goes up and down based on damage and deaths, while the numbers are just slightly more effective on values, kind of like original RE4. I'm not really sure why RE7 and Village both got good systems while the remakes didn't. It's a bit of a mystery, and you're probably wondering, well okay, they didn't mess it up this time, Maxi, why throw it away in this case? Well, much like Resident Evil 7, Village is a very well-balanced game, giving plenty of resources and options to those who take the time to look for them. Even just backtracking a few times or managing your crafting well can ensure a smooth journey through the hordes of Lycans and Lords. Players of all skill level and experience can pick it up on standard or hardcore, and probably enjoy themselves quite a bit with barely any hitches. What I'm trying to say is the Dev 1 team are clearly capable of balancing their games well enough to warrant not having a DA system anymore. I don't think they need to bin it because they messed it up in the remakes, I think they need to bin it because they no longer need to implement it to make sure that everyone can play. 7 and Village prove that, and those came out before and after those remakes. As for Resident Evil 4 Remake, well, the game itself isn't terribly balanced due to the fact that it's going back to the more action-packed formula where you get to stock up on a lot of equipment constantly. In fact, the Resident Evil 4 Remake system tries to split your DA between two categories because of this formula: action points and item points. I personally find that this is a little overcomplicated, but it does balance out better than the fake item points of Resident Evil 2 Remake. The game's difficulty adjustment is also capped appropriately for professional difficulty, so that's good. Overall, it's not bad, it's not great, but there is a big new problem: the DA0 glitch. You see, players found a pretty weird glitch early on where they were killing Del Lago in 7 harpoons. For a couple of weeks, the community didn't know what to think and failed to figure out exactly what was happening to this handful of players, all claiming that Del Lago was going down so quickly on professional difficulty. Well, it turns out that the glitch itself had nothing to do with Del Lago, but with everything that they had done prior to fighting Del Lago. Thus, a glitch hunter by the name of Tetra found the DA0 glitch. Taking damage, doing damage, missing shots, picking up items, discarding items, using storage, it all changes the DA values in this game, and even though action points and item points are separate values, they are both added together to determine the overall DA ranking. Let's say that you somehow have this combined number stuck between 1999 and 2000 via decimals. The game doesn't understand what ranking it is, and it glitches out to be 0 instead of whatever it was prior or whatever it is closer to next. The DA0 means that you just annihilate anything you attack. Even though it'll change back to regular ranking as soon as you shoot, you can still practically one-shot an enemy as if you're playing something easier than assisted. Not only that, but in this case for Del Lago, if you go into a boss fight with DA0 ranking, you can actually keep that ranking while you're doing damage as long as you fight it a certain way. Even though this glitch is probably not going to be encountered by 99.99% of players, it still exists, and it also shows how the DA system can completely mess up the purpose of choosing a difficulty in the first place. Now, let me just say this. There are so many talented people at Capcom, providing us with some of the best experiences in gaming today. I don't know what it's like to be a developer in that position, but if I had to suggest anything to the Dev 1 team based on my own knowledge of the Resident Evil games, I would say that it's time to really reflect on how well they were able to balance 7 and Village with a minimalistic DA system, and make sure that there are necessary tweaks made to prevent it from making big experience-altering changes like the remakes. If that just isn't possible, then scrap the system entirely. I truly believe that it's not needed anymore, and it simply overcomplicates the first decision that every player makes when they start a new Resident Evil game: picking a difficulty. With that said, I would love to hear your thoughts and experiences with difficulty adjustment in the comments, and whether or not you think it should be binned for good, like I do. I would also like to take a moment to thank you very much for watching and for listening. I hope that this was an educational experience for you. As always, clicking that little thumbs up is appreciated, and make sure you subscribe if you haven't already done so for more long-form documentary content on speedrunning, challenge runs, and horror games in general. I'll leave videos that you may enjoy on the end screen. Thank you again for watching, much love, and I'll see you next time.